Hello and welcome to Personable, a podcast focused on speaking to the world's best, enabling you to become the best that you can be. Today, I'm honoured to be joined by Sean Donovan. Sean is the Asian president of Omnicom Advertising Group, where he leads a 4,000-person team across 12 markets, bringing together creative powerhouses TBWA, BBDO and DDB. A former management consultant who delivered projects across 40-plus African banks, Sean transitioned into advertising leadership, serving as president of TBWA Asia and previously as group CEO of TBWA South Africa and CEO of TBWA, twice named Global Agency of the Decade. He also co-founded the communications agency OPENCO, acquired by TBWA in 2013. Sean holds degrees from Smurfit School of Business at UCD, is a tech startup founder and chairperson of Campaigning for Cancer, and he's also the proud husband to Karen and father to Maliki. I'm incredibly excited to have you on today. I wanted to get started off by asking you how you became president of the company that you're working at today.
Well, thanks for having me, Harvey. It's a privilege and a pleasure to be here, and great to see you again. So I guess the origin story, I'll try to make it fairly succinct. So I was born in Ireland, in Dublin. I grew up in the northwest corner, a place called Donegal. Anyone that knows Ireland knows that that's a destination. It's not somewhere you pass through, it's somewhere you end at. The next stop is the US. So it's quite a rural area, very beautiful area, but economically not a lot going on. And it tends to breed a lot of people that emigrate. My maternal grandparents from there, they were sort of migrant laborers to Scotland over the years. And you tend to, if you do fairly well in school and you want to go to university, you tend to leave. And then a lot of times, a lot of people don't come back. And that's very much my journey as well. I sort of left when I was 17, went to Dublin to study architecture. I sort of realized that I was never going to be the world's best architect as I graduated. So I decided to not practice, go into project management as a means out. So I went to the management consulting. That led me to South Africa. And I was there for a couple of years. I worked in, as you said, financial services sector. Very interesting, but I wouldn't say it made me jump out of bed in the morning. I enjoyed my job. I enjoyed the people, but it didn't sort of fulfill me, let's put it like that. Ireland was doing extremely well at that stage. It was the midst of the Celtic Tiber. Some of you might remember that. I was going to study in France, do an MBA, decided to kill two birds with the one stone, go to Ireland, see if I wanted to move back there. And I really thought that doing a degree like an MBA would maybe give me a breath to help me make an informed decision, which it did. I really enjoyed marketing. I really enjoyed the advertising component of it. And I realized that actually I really loved that as a kid. I used to watch those, I'm showing my age here, but those Clive James programs that would show like 2 hours of ads from around the world. Myself and my brother used to watch those things. And I thought, okay, yeah, I was fortunate and I found something that really resonated with me. I went to my lecturer at the time, Barry, who had an agency that he'd sold in Ireland. And he went to me and said, don't do it. And I think those people that know me well will probably attest to the fact that if you want to get me to do something, tell me not to do it. So I was like, right, I'm all in here. So fortunately for me, I found that. Unfortunately for me, Ireland is a very small industry when it comes to advertising and marketing. But fortunately for me, South Africa is a very big one. Strangely punches above its weight on the world stage. So I made my way back to South Africa. I made my way into the industry. As you said in the intro, I ended up joining and running an agency called Hunt Lascaris, which is a world-round agency. From there, prior to that, I started my own agency. They bought it, went in there, went on to run TBWA in the country, went on to run TBWA in Asia. And then as of January the 1st, under a reorg, we formed the Omnicom Advertising Group. So look after TBWA, BBDO and DDB. So that's the short version. All sounds very linear, very straightforward, loads of mistakes along the way, as there always is, but we always paper over those anyway.
No, of course, it's the perfect resume. It may seem very obvious to you, but I feel like to me, you're actually the first person I've ever spoken to within the advertising industry, not just on this podcast, but in my own life. And I'm sure it's the same for a lot of my listeners. And I feel like there's a disconnect between simply seeing ads on a screen, and I don't think people spend much time thinking what actually goes on behind the scenes in creating the advert. I'd love if you could describe to me define what is advertising and what is the goal of advertising.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I get this a lot. So you move to a country like Singapore, which has a very transient population a lot of the time. You're meeting new people all the time. And it's a curiosity. People generally come for work. So, the what do you do is generally the second question that comes up in conversation. And you say advertising, people go, "Oh, that must be tough because nobody watches ads anymore." Right? So the concept of advertising, especially if you're of a certain generation, is appointment viewing that was TV, radio, print, or whatever led. It's a very, very narrow definition of how people see it. What it is really is about, I would say, the ability to influence. So it's the ability to influence a perception on a product, service, a point of view, whatever the brand is that you're advertising. It's really about the ability to tell a coherent story and to compel people into action. And that's it. So if I was to say that's the definition, it broadens the concept. And, people of a certain generation will remember that as a 30-second TV spot. But in reality, that used to be when you had a very narrow view of media consumption in the world. And it still plays a role, especially certain markets like India. TV consumption is still a huge thing, for example, in this part of the world. But it really goes through everything. It's a full brand experience. So, that ability to persuade can be from, a story that's told on TV through to an influencer strategy on TikTok, through to an in-store experience. And if you think Apple's one of our dear clients, it's one of our longest standing clients. You think of Apple, you can probably think of it in terms of a holistic ecosystem of experience, from the piece of film you see through to the product features that you experience. If they talk about shot on iPhone, through to that in-store experience, through to the communities that are built inside Apple stores, for example. So the definition of advertising hasn't changed. It's about influence, but the ability to practice it and where that influence can manifest has got so broad, and it's become really exciting.
Yeah, I think there's two different points on that. Firstly, with Apple, I can recall getting my first iPad. I think my brother got like the iPad 2 or whatever it was.
Yeah.
If with every Apple product, and I feel like I've kind of changed my opinion over time, and I'm not trying to get you in trouble with Apple, but maybe I'll share my opinion a bit later. But I found that when I first got an Apple device, everything I did, it could be the exact same as another phone like a Samsung or an Android, but it just felt a little bit more special. I think it was probably through the advertising that made me think that way. But, just the way that the home screen was designed, it was just so satisfying. And I think that was the same for so many people. And so that encouraged them to use iMessage and all of the apps that are specifically on Apple, and obviously the iOS software. But that was the intelligence of using the advertising. But what I think is truly unique, and when I ask the question, what is the goal of advertising? I don't think it's as linear as many other things, because there are so many different things you can do. You can encourage someone to buy something, think positively or negatively over a person, a thing. It might be trying to, just show you something, and so to influence how you think about things over a longer period of time. On that sort of point, when you first get a campaign, or maybe you have a recurring client like Apple who are releasing a new product in time, how do you look at, looking back, how do you look at what a successful campaign looked like and what an unsuccessful campaign looked like? Is it purely from a metric standpoint of how many people watched it? Is it conversions to how many people bought a product? Is it the artistic design? How does that look into your mind, both looking backwards and using those touch points to be able to make the best campaigns moving forward?
That's a great question, Harvey. And you're into a real, I would say, and there will be people that would have a different point of view, quite a militant different point of view to me on this. When you get into the area of marketing and comms and advertising in general, I'm probably maybe a boring person. That I'm a centralist. I don't exist in extremes. I think a lot of debate in the current zeitgeist is also about I'm right and you're wrong. I think there is a very sort of, I would say, pragmatic position in the center to say it's a bit about everything, right? There's bits of right in everything. There's bits of wrong in everything. And you will say sort of in the marketing advertising sphere, you would say, like more recently, the zeitgeist is about, especially media fragmentation, digital channels, growth, et cetera, et cetera. It's all about like performance at scale. It's about nobody watches TV anymore. I'm being very simplistic. So I'm only going to target Harvey on his mobile in one of the social feeds, right? And it's precision at scale and all the rest of it. And there's a part to that. You see brands being built. So if you're familiar with I'll digress for a second, if you're familiar with the concept of the marketing funnel, I spoke recently at an event, my old alumni actually, they were in Singapore. I asked them to still teach the funnel of, awareness, consideration, purchase, blah, blah, blah. And they still do, but the funnel is dead, right? Because anyone can enter a brand.
Sorry,
or
could you
can
just
any of those
very
actions.
quickly explain the funnel for people that don't understand it? I think I've got an idea,
Sure.
but I think it's just good to have clarity on it.
Sure. So the funnel is basically a concept of broad to narrow being the point of purchase, and then there's post-purchase. So broad being awareness. So let's stick with Apple. You've never heard of Apple. So we create some communications, etc., that educate you as to the Apple brand, etc., etc. And then the next stage is consideration. So you go, okay, actually, I'm in the market for, let's say, a phone. And I go, okay, yeah, Apple's one of the ones I'll look alongside Samsung, etc. And then trial might be you go into the store and you try it out, like you said, the interface is special, and then you purchase. So that's the funnel. So you go, many people, you communicate with them, and you get to a few at the point of conversion, right? So that's the sort of traditional view of advertising. Advertising played the awareness role, et cetera, all the way down. And that's totally changed, right? Because that was predicated on the perception that you were aware of a brand, you wanted to find out about it, you tried it, and then you bought it. The reality is the funnel is dead now. The funnel is a circle. Anyone can enter that at any point in time. So let's say, for argument's sake, Insta, right? I've done it. I'm sure you've probably done it. You've seen something on Insta, the brand you've been absolutely unaware of, but you're actually going, okay, that looks pretty good. So I'll buy it because I can hit the shop now button, get it delivered. So you can actually build brand post-purchase now. You can make the purchase and then you can actually build brand. So that changes things quite dramatically. So we're living in a very new world, and you got to be conscious of both of those things. But the more things change, the more they stay the same as well. So there is the ability to be very precise, and we have all the metrics, and I can see how my campaign worked in Insta, et cetera, et cetera. But you also have to build brand as well, because you have to do two jobs. So brand for tomorrow and sales for today. For me, the most successful campaign or most successful work is that achieves both those metrics. Sales can be achieved by hardcore promotion. I can give you a 25% discount, right? But that's not going to sustain you in the long run. So it's a duality, brand and sales. And there's a lot of research. Les Binet he retired recently from one of our companies, DDB in London. Adam and Eve, who done a lot of research in that field to show that, the most significant aspect of value creation in the long term is building brand and also doing short-term performance. So it's about both. So for me, it's a centralist point of view. You want to build brand for tomorrow, but you want to achieve sales for today.
Yeah, I think those are really interesting perspectives on both points in terms of the long-term building the brand and also the death of the funnel, because as someone that's not in the industry, the only thing I've ever thought about, and even speaking to business professors at Duke, they still talk to me about this idea of a funnel within social media. And on top of that, I feel like with myself, a lot of what I've been doing with this podcast, for example, is constantly trying to build up my brand, connect with amazing people. And I've been very brand focused, but I think my goal still has been, try and get more views, and I'm still trying to work on that. But I think to know that if you build a good thing, people will come anyway. I mean, it's the exact same with what Elon Musk did with Tesla. He didn't spend a dime on advertising because he built the best thing he possibly could. And then over time, it did really well. We can talk about, what Tesla's like now in 2025, but I still think that story is pretty incredible. Sorry, go on.
No, sorry. I was just going to agree with you, Harvey. I think absolutely right. The opposite of what I sort of just said there is you also can't build a brand on like feet of clay, right? You also can't promise a whole brand story, but your product underwhelms as well. There's a good saying that says nothing kills a bad product as quickly as bad advertising, right? So you have to be consistent. And I think all the best brands in the world, you talk about the brand component, but ultimately they're about great product experience, right? It's, I bought a Tesla, my first Tesla, maybe 3 years ago. And I was absolutely amazed, right? It totally disrupted the car buying experience, right? From, the fact there's no dealerships, the interface that's there, how it looked inside, et cetera, et cetera. Fundamentally, a brand has to be built on a good product, like you said about Apple earlier on as well, and that made you feel just that little bit special.
When I was around 12, 13, so this would have been, I guess, around 2012, I want to say. Or no, not 2012, maybe like 2016, 2017. I'm a bit older than I thought I was. 2016.
It happens to us all, Harvey. Don't worry. It only gets worse with age.
When I was around 2016, I was around 12 years old. I thought that social media was the future. It was around when all these YouTubers were starting to come out and they'd talk online. It was these videos just kind of filmed with people's hands with minimal editing, and they'd kind of do fun pranks and challenges, etc. And younger me, I was still in primary school at the time, in my last 1 or 2 years at primary school, thought if I can gain a following on social media, I can then use that to sell products. I'd kind of had the realization back at that point in time that if I could connect with an audience online, that they would be more invested in me. I could then use that to build my own products, companies, etc. That didn't work out for me. I ended up having a YouTube channel called Bracken Clothing. I had like 50 subscribers. I would talk on a weekly basis trying to talk about a brand, Supreme, which you may have heard of. And I would use that to resell clothes. In actuality, thinking back, I didn't actually get any, it's not like I gained a huge following. But on that brand point, I did build a brand in which using social media, I seemed more authentic and it seemed more verifiable, and it made it seem like I knew more than I actually did about the clothes, so then people would want to buy it more from me. On that sort of point, there's kind of two questions within this. I'm curious at how the landscape of social media has changed advertising for you and where you see that going forward. And then sort of adjacently to that, where you see the world of NIL. I know you're working within Asia, so I don't know if you're as up to date with NIL going on in the US. But I'm curious on those 2 points of how they've changed the landscape of advertising for you and your company, and where you see that going forward.
Yeah, so really good questions again. And, you touch on a lot of things there, Harvey. The perception that it's easy, right? So you just get out there, because everyone can be a publisher now. It's the one thing that social media has done for everyone. Everyone has the ability to publish and send out to the world, right? But it's not just a case of sending it out there and they will come, right? There's a lot of work that goes behind the scenes. There's a lot of algorithms that sit on the platforms, that you have to follow quite rigidly to grow a base, et cetera, et cetera. So that's very true. Your first question there about social media, how it's changed the landscape, absolutely has. If I think about I started my own agency July 2008. The iPhone, I think it was 2 or 3 or whatever. It was the first iPhone that was introduced in South Africa. Came in September. I got an iPhone that September. And I just didn't know how that was fundamentally going to change the industry. None of us really knew, and how things were going to go, but it's absolutely fundamentally changed it. It's changed it in the sense that everyone can be a publisher. But it's also changed it in the sense that anyone can be a consumer at any point in time, 24 hours a day. And yeah, there's all the stuff in social media, and there's the ability, TikTok started as these like wacky little dances and all the rest of it. And I think it's easy. I say this is a conversation I had probably 18 months ago, I'd say, especially my New York teammates. From an Asia point of view, it's sort of easy to say, where Asia had been maybe 18 months, 2 years ahead on some of these platforms like TikTok, where it morphed from a dance platform that teenagers used. It was still the case in the US, and being simplistic just deliberately to be provocative. But we worked quite closely with TikTok, and a couple of things that blew me away. We'd done a white paper with them 2 years ago. And certainly the team that we dealt with, they changed their KPIs every 3 months. Like, that's a phenomenal thing to consider, right? If you consider everything that goes around changing one's KPIs every 3 months, it absolutely shows a company that's not about, entertainment and cute little dances. It's a company that's about speed, agility, the future, maximization. I think we then saw it around the region here, where they sort of betaed TikTok Music here. They launched TikTok Shop here in Indonesia, for example. I'll probably misremember the numbers, so forgive me, but just take it as illustrative rather than definitive. But TikTok Shop launched, I think, in Indonesia in March 2023. By the time it got to October 2023, they ran into some difficulties with the government, and they were subsequently resolved. But I think I read a stat that it went from obviously 0 to 25% of all GRV e-com sales in Southeast Asia in that 7-month period. So it's absolutely phenomenal. So that changes things for them. And that goes from, A huge influencer on the platform talking about something. We use it, for example, in some Starbucks campaigns. You see it there where people talk about, latest merch or whatever, right the way through to, a teenager in Indonesia who might be streaming to 15, 20 people selling cosmetics, right? And sort of everything in between. But the power and the size of it, and, the fact that effectively social media can bring the ability to purchase right into homes has changes things fundamentally, absolutely fundamentally. It changes, I think, on maybe a less marketing level, but maybe a more societal level. It changes sort of the point of views and the perspectives that we're exposed to. The algorithms. I mean, one of the things you have to be conscious of is that I think social media certainly being start of it, and maybe the elegant pinnacle sort of representation is AI, where algorithms are certainly flattening culture. We're exposed to less, where suits our needs. So we're given by default, less and less perspectives. So there's that change that goes on there as well. But it absolutely has fundamentally changed not just marketing, but also I think communications within society as well.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about social media is it doesn't feel like advertising. It feels like you're talking to a friend. So there's a popular YouTuber in the UK, and the American equivalent is the popular YouTuber in the UK is called KSI, and the American equivalent is Logan Paul. And what's so interesting about these relationships, I think they're called parasocial relationships, in which we have we feel like we're friends with KSI because he's talking to us on YouTube, whatever, and we can feel like we know everything about him, but he knows nothing about me. And that's the exact same for 20 million people. And so whenever he says, I'm doing a boxing match, whenever he says I'm doing a charity match, I'm selling Prime, I'm working with Mr. Beast, we personally feel like we're cheering him on. Yet he still knows nothing about us, but whenever he releases anything, we instantly feel like we want to buy it. And at no point in time does it feel like we're being advertised or marketed or being thought to think in a different way. It just feels like we're cheering on the people that we feel like should win. And I think it's so interesting, both that point, but also the culture point, because culture is being eroded away as everyone consumes the same thing. Because if something gets 50 to 100 million views, that's not just like the UK only has a population of, I think, 66 million. So that's probably touching points all across the world. I went to Bali this summer with one of my best friends from home, and it kind of made me upset. There were some people, on the street in Bali, and you'd think that young kids would be playing, football or throwing some ball or running around together, and I couldn't see any of them. And I every kid that I saw was on a phone scrolling TikTok. It was just insane, and you'd hear the exact same songs, like the meme songs and the meme dances that we would listen to in the UK or in the US, or I'm sure in South Africa and in Asia, on these streets. And it's both genius but also kind of upsetting to realize how big these corporations and brands are able to get within the cultures. I'd be curious, like, what you think about that.
I mean, I think as a human, there's a degree of truth to how you feel about that. But, I think also when you try to sort of distill it out, and I'm not saying it's right or it's wrong, right? But, probably my parents' generation would be like, TV's bad. It's terrible that the kids are all watching TV. And maybe their parents' generation were probably like, well, radio is really bad. It's terrible that the kids are all, listening to radio and stuff like that. And I think, right or wrong, I think it's probably an inevitability of civilization, right? And of change and of evolution to a degree as well. I mean, I do share some concerns, obviously. My son is 19. He was probably just on the cusp. He was probably like yourself, a little bit just, saved by time in terms of the social media tidal pool. You look now and you see not just social media, but also the ability, just the ubiquitous consumption of content. To be brutally honest, I remember from about 1 till about 3 was a nightmare with our son, right? Going to restaurants. We didn't go to restaurants 2 years because as soon as the food came, they were up and out and crying or whatever it is. And if I had an iPad to give them, I probably would have did that, I would have done that. So I think there's a couple of things that one needs to be conscious of in that, which is, trying to regulate behavior, even as an adult, right? I mean, I find it myself. My attention span has definitely decreased. I'm much less patient towards long form content and editorial. I'm like, quick, just give me the highlights quick. I don't need to read all this nuance. Just give it to me. So that's something I have to work on. I think all of us, right? As these bite-sized chunks, platforms are there to serve us, to give us a bit of a sort of a rush by consuming it in small pieces. We have to be on guard of that. And I think especially as adolescent brains are developing, children brains are developing, as parents, we have a role to play in that as well. So I don't think it's all, as much as I say it's every generation assumes their crisis is the worst. It was TV that, before that was radio. Yeah, I think we do need to be careful about how we expose people to how they consume content.
Yeah, I also think it's interesting on the point of, I think TikTok just gives you more of what you want. It's not exactly like it's this thing and it's tricking how we think.
Mm-hmm.
It's just an algorithm that's designed around us. And on the point that you just mentioned, which I thought was really interesting with regard to give me the highlights, just tell me like the 5 most important things. I think it goes from a point in which we were kind of expected to watch 2 hours worth of mostly nonsense, when in actuality you could get the snippet within 5 seconds. I want to ask, I want to give you some like high level points, and it'd be great if you don't have to ask questions directly, but more just, give your overall scope with regard to managing people, talent, and relationships. So I was going to say, what's the key to long lasting client agency relationships? How do you find the best talent? What do you wish more leaders understood about managing people? And how do you create a space where ideals can truly flow?
Yeah. So let me start with the relationships one. Let me start with the client relationships one. When you're in the service industry, which we're also in an aspect of the industry that sells subjectivity, right? So, we're not in the business of having a machine that's quality controlled and we switch it on and the product comes out perfectly formed and there's no argument about the quality of the product, right? We're not in that space. We're in the space of ideas, and ideas are inherently subjective, and inherently there's an aspect of trust there. So I'll put a pin in that. I go back then to what we do and what it represents. And creativity inherently is an act of defiance, right? It's about saying, disrupting the status quo. It's about saying that's a convention. We're going to disrupt this and let's go with it. So inherently, it's a conversation about risk. So I think if you contextualize that and you accept that, right, you very quickly get to an understanding that in any good relationship, so not just a professional one, a personal one or whatever, if you're asking a person to take a risk with you, so, if you ask your brother or your sister to do a tandem bungee jump with you, they're going to say yes because they accept that, they trust that you have taken care of all the risk and that you will have given them assurance that everything's taken care of. And maybe sound like a bit of a silly example, but it's the same thing in a professional relationship where you have subjective outcome, which is about risk, right? You cannot build a strong client relationship, have a good client relationship, do great work if you haven't got the fundamentals right, if you haven't taken care of the risk part. Risk gets taken care of by consistently delivering and keeping your word. Keeping your word gets done by scoping properly what you're going to do, telling people what you're going to do, explaining to what they're going to do, take them on the journey, and then obviously delivering on it. And then only then, when you have taken care of all of those fundamental steps, can you get to a point where you ask a client to take a risk with you and great things happen. So it's about getting the basics right. It's about establishing credibility. It's about delivering on your word, and then it's about delivering consistently, and then it's about asking clients to go on a journey with you. And I'll give you an example, which I took some of our teams through. One of our clients is BMW in China. It is a massive market for BMW, and the work that our agency there does for BMW, if you were to see it, you go, this is like no BMW work I've ever seen before in my life. It's been awarded internationally. It's been awarded a Cannes. That's like a sort of an advertising Oscars, if you want to call it that. But that work would never have been done just off the bat at the outset. That work was done after 3 years of building a relationship with the client, which is about delivering consistently, doing what you say you're going to do, doing more than you're going to say do, and then asking permission for a client to take risks. So I think that's the fundamental. It's like any basic relationship building blocks. It's about doing what you say you're going to do It's about being dependable. It's about over delivering, and then it's like asking people to go on a journey of risk with you. So that would be my answer to the client one. In terms of the leadership one, I guess if you ask 100 people, you get 100 different answers. I guess my own view to that would be how I've interpreted leadership. I think I'd probably give you maybe a interpretation, an action, and probably like a sort of a practical application of that. And, I think there's a saying, I don't know who said it, so I hope they forgive me for appropriating it, but that leadership is what happens when you leave the room. And I think that for me very much encapsulates how you approach leadership, and we've all probably come across, right, in various aspects of our lives, different interpretations to that. If my own view, if your view of what leadership means is you'll get the, I don't know, whatever parking space closest to the door. If you want just the accoutrements and the benefits of leadership, you're probably not going to be a great leader, right? There's a degree of servant leadership in everything. I had a conversation in this room in 2020 where we were a little bit ahead of COVID in Asia, probably a month, 6 weeks, 8 weeks ahead of the Western world. And my Canadian CEO colleague asked me to have a chat to an industry body there to say how we're dealing with it. And it was pretty tough, right? I mean, we forget about it a little bit, but it was pretty tough in those early days of COVID where really no one knew where it was going to go. We're going to lockdowns, what was going to happen, etc. And I remember thinking at the time, and what I said to them was, give me an ability to reflect on leadership. And I felt at the time that you could take maybe 3 views of it. This is how I felt. One, you could look at it like burdensome, and it is burdensome, right? Like leadership, you get out of the way when things are going well, right? You set up the environment for success, the people that are there, and you get out of the way and let them get on with it. And generally, you're over-indexed of when it's going wrong, right? That's part of it. So you can look at it as burdensome. You can look at it like an obligation. I'm paid to do this. I have to do this. This is my job, Or you can look at it like a privilege, right? And like many things in life, how you look at something defines how you will be, right? And the attitude you have towards it and the outcomes you're going to get. I think leadership is a privilege. And for me at that time during COVID, it absolutely was. It was hard. It was tough. And many of the leaders that I worked with. But, we set ourselves a mission. And one of the missions we set ourselves is we have control over how many jobs we can save here, for example. That was just one aspect. And we work towards that. We focus on that. We have control how we can help our clients. And we work towards that and we focused on that. And it was a real privilege to be in that position. So I would say the first thing about leadership for me, the positive aspect, is how you approach it, what you want to achieve out of it. I would say the second thing is how you choose to practice it. There's a sort of a, perennial discussion about nature and nurture. For example, are leaders born or are they made? And I've been privileged within Omnicom University, which uses, amongst the people, Harvard Business School lecturers, and I've been privileged to spend a bit of time with some of them. The one that really resonated with me was Nancy Cohn. She's done a lot on leadership, leadership in crisis. She's a remarkable lady, and I really got a lot from her. And she talks a lot about her belief, which I subscribe to, is it's not born into you. It's not nature, it's nurture. You learn to be a leader. And she cites plenty of leaders, famous leaders over history, that when called into a particular situation, they stepped up effectively. And she said something that really resonated with me. Many things, but one of the things she said that resonated with me, which is, especially as you get older or more senior, and generally speaking, there's oftentimes a correlation between those two things. So whether you get senior or older is not the same thing. It's you have to ask yourself, and you have to constantly check, have you reached your acceptable level of decline? And that statement is really profound, like your acceptable level of decline. And it can apply to any aspect of your life, health, relationships, your family, spirituality, if you're spiritual, but also your work, right? Have you just, on your acceptable level of decline, is this thing that's so insidious and so small that you don't notice it and you creep up, right? And leadership is a muscle. It's like going to the gym. You have to work on it. The older, the more senior you get, where you move from more direct control into the micro to more indirect control of the micro and more direct control of the macro and the influence. I think it's a really good thing to remember. I think you should also bear in mind that the further senior we are, the further we are about the knowledge as well, right? A lot of the times. So I think you've got to, that concept of, is this your acceptable level of decline, is really important. And I would say the third aspect, which is an application one, then is, there's that great saying, which is, culture is defined by the worst behavior you're willing to tolerate. Again, I don't know who I can attribute that to, so I hope they'll forgive me. And culture is about community, right? And I think your role as a leader, as I said, is you're in there when it's going bad, when it's about setting up the culture, it's setting up the community standards, it's setting up the behavior, it's setting up what you will tolerate, being very clear to them what you won't tolerate, and then it's like getting out of the way, because communities will always outlast bureaucracies. And I think for me, they're the three aspects of leadership that I try to focus on and try to nurture.
Wow, that was incredible. I was taking notes throughout everything you were saying. I was just like, seriously, every point you had there, I was just like, that's insane. I mean, obviously, like, this, that's why you're good at your job, but I was just in awe. So thank you for sharing all of that. That was awesome. Could I ask one more point on that? And that was, how do you create a space where ideas can truly flow?
That is a very good question, right? So as I said before, creativity is an act of defiance, right? So I fundamentally believe this, and I'll say this because it's very hard not to then just get to the context, or it's important to acknowledge the context. Let me put it like that. So first of all, creativity, ideas, just use creativity as an umbrella term. You have to create an environment of psychological safety for creativity, right? Creativity does not flourish in fear. Fear delivers what we did yesterday, an incrementalism. Creativity is about non-incrementalism and stuff we didn't know, was capable of tomorrow. So it's inherently about taking risk. And I think there's two pieces of context that are really important now that I try to keep reminding the teams of here. The first is, statistics show a lot of companies are very good at being better. They're not very good at being different. And there's many, many reasons for that. And there's lots of research on that and all the rest of it. But one of the things I find interesting, just to take it down to one snapshot, is if you look at the leadership of listed companies, be it the FTSE 100, Fortune 500, whatever, statistically, if you look at the leadership of those, and I know leadership is not just one person, but, let's just go with it for the sake of being simplistic. Vast majority are accountants, lawyers, economists to a lesser degree. If you look at those three professions by default, and it's not to discount their value at all, I'm not saying that, right? But those three professions are ultimately deterministic, right? So in a lawyer, you win litigation, you lose it. There's a debit and a credit in accountancy, it's up and a down, supply and demand in economics. There are by default deterministic cultures, right? They're also in careers in which success is attributed, certainly early in your career, by knowing the answer, right? You don't go to a lawyer and feel really great about yourself if they go, well, I don't know.
Not sure.
Not sure about that. They go, yeah, Harvey versus Shaw, 1984 case law. Exactly. But in actual fact, that means if they're deterministic and the sort of attributes of success are surrounded by being right, or, if I'm just being a bit provocative, by having the confidence and sound that you're right, they're inherently anti-creative, right? Because creativity comes from saying, I don't know. That's a very good question. Let me go and find out the answer for that. Let me expand my knowledge set. And I think, it sounds a bit counterintuitive, but, when I realized this, I was like, yeah, I'd rather go to a lawyer that sort of said, that's a very good question, let me find it out, and come back with 4 other scenarios than just go, well, no, I'm very clear. Harvey versus Shaw in 1984, this was the case law. So you have that in the context, in the cultural context. And I think it's also, our current, certainly Western economic system, not just Western, but it sort of rewards incrementalism. The analysts say give us this much every quarter and and that's how we go. So you have that context. That's a reality that exists there. Then on the other contexts, I mentioned it earlier on, social media, algorithms flattening culture, and AI in the last couple of years, Gen AI for argument's sake, or ChatGPT or whatever, all the applications of that, really is a sort of an elegant sort of summary of that principle of algorithms flattening culture. When all these things are trained on the same data sets and people have the same ability to ask questions and, get the same answers, right? And there's absolutely an amazing role for Gen AI, and we use it all the time. But there's certain roles that it's probably not great for, which is like creativity, right? If you were to go in and five of us were to ask ChatGPT, give me a business idea that'll make me a millionaire in the next year, give me top 5 ideas, we'll all get the same. And I'm pretty much guarantee you none of them will be successful, right? So I think in those two contexts, creativity is critical, right? It's about being a contrarian view, a different path towards it. And I love the example, it's a cliche for a reason, and I'll get it a little bit wrong, but you get the point. Steve Jobs said, if you ask consumers, what they wanted in the ideal phone, they would have said a Nokia with a 2-week battery life. There'd never be an iPhone, right? An iPhone was an act of defiance. That creativity was an act of defiance. And I know I've butchered that quote and that statistic, but I think you get the point. So I'd say you have to create psychological safety and the permission to be creative. You have to create the environment that allows you to do it. And I think you have to be conscious of the context that stops people from being it, and create an environment that allows them to give them a channel within that allows them to do what they need to do.
What are you most proud of?
My natural answer to that would be my family, my son, my wife. That would be my gut answer. If you ask me from a professional point of view, I would say it's the fact that I've been able to maintain an environment, didn't create it, other people did, maintain an environment where I really love getting out of bed in the morning to go to work with the people that I work with, right? And it doesn't matter how tough it gets, whether that was COVID, whether that was the current economic headwinds that we have, in this part of the world. China's been a pretty tough environment to operate in for the last couple of years. The economic recovery after COVID has not really come. No secrets, that affects a large part of the region. But despite all of that, I love and I'm most proud of that I get to work with people, and we've maintained an environment where we can do what we need to do and still love getting together and have a laugh when we do it.
What's one misconception about creativity that you constantly challenge?
That it can be made irrelevant by a machine. That ChatGPT, Gen AI will effectively replace the need for ingenuity and creativity. I think that's the one that we deal with a lot. And if you were to sort of try to expand on it a little bit, going back to some of the questions you asked earlier about what makes success, value or success, I think a lot of the time in the current world, especially when things get a little bit tough, people often can default, I take sort of slightly lazy mental paths towards looking at efficiency and not just efficacy. And value and success is based on efficiency and efficacy, right? You can be make it as efficient as you want, but if it's not effective, there's no value created. So I would say the one conception or the one misconception is that efficiency trumps efficacy, which it doesn't.
How do you help brands navigate purpose versus performance?
Yeah, that's a big question, Harvey. And I think if you were asking me that question, I think 2-3 years ago, there was a lot more brands talking about purpose and how purpose would lead to that. I think that's died off a little, I would say. It doesn't make it less important. And I think, I think my own view is I think we all have a role to play in society, and it's not a linear and it's not a very narrow role. A lot of the time. I think we have many stakeholders that we need to perform to, adhere to, appease, many jobs that need to be done. And I don't think they're mutually exclusive, right? I think, I mentioned that a couple of years ago, we were talking a lot about purpose. I do think a lot of people would agree with me that the pendulum had swung quite a lot. And there's a lot of companies that we're a purpose brand, but at the end of the day, you're selling toothpaste or you're selling shampoo, you're selling all that stuff. And I think, boring position, as I said, I'm a centralist. I think you can achieve both, right? I think you can leverage purpose to achieve performance in sales. I don't think one can or should be at the expense of the other.
How do you see the future of brand experience evolving?
So, I mean, yeah, that's a very pertinent question. And I think it's the heart of everything you've just been talking about, right? Brand experience. A brand is how, in very simple terms, it's how people feel about you, right? Be that your personal brand, be that your product brand, your service brand, whatever it is. And that is made up of all of the touch points across the experience spectrum. So as those broaden, which they have, it's often thought that the last great single appointment viewing moment was the finale of Friends, whenever that was. And I can't remember, there was a crazy amount of people watched it in the US, and then they wanted to talk about it at the cooler box the next day. And now we've all gone into little bubbles. Oh, sorry, at the water cooler the next day. So we've all gone into little bubbles now of content consumption, and that's broadened massively. And I think that the future is, as a brand, you need to be conscious of all of those, and you need to show up in all those, and you need to be purposeful and have a strategy about how you're going to appear in all of those. And as I said earlier on, that's Apple. It's everything from the comms that you see through to packaging that you get, that satisfying tear you get when you open the packaging, and you unwrap that product right through to the store experience and the product, post-product experience, the Apple Care warranty, and everything in between. So the canvas is expanding. It behooves brands to be conscious of all of that and to have a solution for all of those touch points.
I just looked it up. The Friends finale had 52.5 million viewers. But then when you compare that to Squid Game, which has had over 220 million viewers over a season, it's almost like night and day, almost 4x for Squid Game, which is pretty insane.
It is. The one difference I would say, though, is that everyone had to be present at the same time to watch Friends, and had to then go in to talk about it the next day at the water cooler over the coffee cup. People can consume Squid Games any time,
Well, then I'd say the Super Bowl would be then my rebuttal to that, where you get 30 million viewers, right?
Yeah, and that is it, right? I mean, it's live sports, it's news, etc., and that's it. But you also, if I look at some of the, say, I was looking at some Apple work in China, some stats the other day from the Chinese New Year campaign. It's like 400 million views. So you just have all of these opportunities.
How could you take me on the journey from ideation, or at least even before that point, when you first start working with a brand, or you're starting on a new campaign with a brand, from that point in time to the actual implementation of it, and then you're looking back at the campaign you've just done?
As in, functionally, how does it happen? Or
yeah, like maybe you sit in a room and you come up with ideas, and then there's different teams coming up with ideas, and then you're at the top, so you pick the best idea. And then you maybe hire different teams. I'm not really sure of the process.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good question. So I think the first thing to sort of acknowledge is, creativity has moved from the divine interpretation of one person, this sort of creative god that came up, the aha moment, to having to be a bit more robust in terms of data. So if I take, say, sitting in Singapore at the moment, so take the Singapore office, for example, they have 30 data scientists sitting in there that are pulling data from, and we call it cultural data, from, cross online activity. And the base below that is within TBWA, for example. There's about 350 culture spotters around the world that are doing that on a daily basis and sending that up and aggregating it. The data team here takes 30, 35 data sources, plugs them together, and sort of layers data on top of things to try and get a profile of what's going on. So it's gone very much from I think to I know, right? I think the number one danger in marketing is that you market to yourself, right? So you think you want to see the marketing activity the way you would consume the product and your own biases. So it's important that you have data to actually to influence what you want to do. So that's the first point. It starts with data. The second then is that data informs strategy. So the strategy says, okay, this is the target market. These are the type of people. Data's pulled in to say who they are. It's I talk about, mentioned the funnel earlier on and how that's probably not as relevant anymore. but I would say segmentation is probably not as relevant as it used to be anymore in terms of strictly demographic or psychographic or whatever. I think you have to acknowledge that, first of all, you're competing with everything in culture, right? So all that medium fragmentation we talked about, you have to break through that. And the second thing is, I don't think you can sort of take strict demographic and psychographic measures quite literally anymore. And I think you have to look at identities, and I think you have to acknowledge that there's maybe three parts to an identity. The foundational identity, let's say if the target market was Singapore, there are certain characteristics, traits, learned experiences, etc., that you have to acknowledge. But there's an element of fluidity in that as well, in that people are interacting with Squid Games, K-drama, blah, blah, blah. And then I think there's an element of fragmentation as well, which is, the type of media that they use and the behavior that it's then pushing back on them and generating. So you got to think of those things. That's the role of strategy, to take the data, to take that understanding. Strategists will then come up with a brief and to say, okay, here's the kernel of a thought. And typically then it's handed over to, the traditional creative teams to bring that to life. How do you take that and make it as cut through as possible? And that's then presented to the client. You might go through a few rounds, that's refined, it's bought. You flesh it out then with a media agency to see how we bring it to life. And then you go into production. You might say, okay, we're going to have whatever, 10-minute YouTube piece of film that launches it, but it's then going to break down into a TikTok strategy that's got 50 different influencers bringing it to life in various ways. And there might be an activation or there might be a sponsorship property to it. And that's then brought to life in terms of production. And then ultimately we'll go and have campaign metrics that we'll then measure retrospectively. So whatever you agree those metrics are, we will look at those responses, call to action, sales, or whatever it is. So that's generally the sort of workflow as you go from brief to execution.
Paul has the iPhone, McDonald's has the burger, Google has the search engine. So often you spend time looking at how to advertise and show the best for other brands. But what makes Omnicom different, and what makes firms want to work with you guys? What's your edge?
Okay, so it'll be a slightly industry answer, and I'm conscious that some of this may not mean a lot to you, Harvey. So forgive me. So
all good.
Let me start with a quick retrospective detour to where I came from. So I said I came from TBWA, like you said in the intro. So TBWA is known as the disruption company. That is USP. There's a methodology, disruption. DDB, BBDO have their own point of views on the world. And then if I go up to an Omnicom level with the Omnicom advertising group and the creative agencies, I would say the difference is, and again, forgive me, this will sort of be comparative to other industry players, competitors that may not be massively familiar to you. Omnicom believes in the power of those individual brands. So that point of view that TBWA, BBDO, DDB, collective has is very, very considered, and it's very regarded within an Omnicom world. So first of all, the power of the brand, and that's important because it sets culture, it sets the type of talent you attract, it sets the methodologies you have, the tools that you have, and the point of view on the work that you're going to create. Some of our competitors have taken a slightly different view, where they've sort of denuded the point of view of brands and killed brands off and sort of put them into a single mush. Some of them refer to the fact that the consolidated P&Ls is the power of one. And I would say if I was to put it to one thing within Omnicom, it's the power of choice. The power of choice will always trump the power of one. And creativity will always be seen as a key differentiator in all the things we talked about in today as well. I think some of our competitors talk about creativity of not being accretive, for example. I didn't know what that word meant. I had to look it up at the time when I heard it. But in our point of view, the brands matter because the brands define talent, it defines a point of view in the world, and creativity matters in a sea of sameness.
I've got 3 final questions. The first one being, if I was to ask someone in 100 years' time, what would you want your legacy to be and how would you want to be remembered?
Ooh, good question. So I studied architecture, And I remember when I was interested in applying to study architecture, I spoke to someone who was studying architecture, right? And I said, "What do you like about it? Why did you want to do it?" And they said, "I want to build a building that when I'm dead, people are going to know that it was my building, that was my legacy." I was like, "Okay, that's interesting." Um, and I get a little bit personal now for a second, Harvey, if you don't mind. My mum passed away in 2020, and I went back out. I was fortunate. I was in Singapore. We had a very long lockdown here, long tail on the lockdown. We were able to leave the country, but we weren't necessarily able to get back. But I fortunately, I found a window on the Irish side. I got back for the funeral. I was able to make a funeral, and then I had to apply to get permission, and I obviously made it back to Singapore. But I spent a couple of weeks there. I was there with my dad, and we were going through stuff, sorting through stuff. And both my mum and my dad, early in life, very smart people, but just nature of birth, they didn't have the opportunity to study tertiary education. They both went on later in life. They did, and my mum did after she raised us, and she wanted to study, and she became a psychotherapist, a trauma counselor, and she ran a rape crisis center, a rape crisis network center around Ireland in each of the counties, and she ran that. She retired a few years before she passed away, and I found when I helped my dad sort through her stuff, came across this big envelope of cards that came from her retirement function. And there was like dozens, over 100 cards that people had written her about how she'd helped people. And a lot of personal stories about, how they were effectively her clients or her patients, if you want to call them that, and the impact that she had on her life. And that really made me think at that moment. I was like, yeah, it could be a building, like that guy said to me when I was young. But at that point in time, I realized that it's about helping other people, right? And I think you live on in how you have helped other people and how they can pay it forward then. And I think, go back to the question you asked about leadership. At that point, I realized for me, leadership and the privilege that I have in being in this position that I can is about making people do things they didn't think were possible, that they didn't think were possible of themselves. And I've taken that and I throw people into the deep end all the time. I hold them by the scruff of the neck. They're not going to drown, but I throw them in all the time and I make them realize that they can do things that they didn't think were possible. And if one or two people feel that and benefit from that, then I'm okay with that as a legacy in 100 years.
And my penultimate question is, what's next for you?
I don't really think about what's next for me. Someone told me once very, very early in my career, he said to me, best piece of advice he was given by someone is the best way to worry about what's next is to just worry about the now and don't think about what's next. And I think that's right. I genuinely, I don't think about what's next. I know there's some people out there that have a plan for life and they'll go in 2 years' time, I'll be there. And in 3 years' time, I'll be there. And 3 years' time, I'll be there. My own personal point of view
It's
is
definitely
that
not me. I definitely don't do that.
Well, I think most people that talk like that, it's retrospective, right? They create a nice linear arc, like I said right at the intro, like we paper over all the screw ups we had along the way. So for me, I'll answer that question and say I genuinely don't know because I genuinely don't think about it. I live every day doing the best that I can in the role that I need to be, and that's on multiple facets. My career as a parent, hopefully achieving it right there, don't know, as a husband, as a son, and all the rest of it. And that's always been my philosophy.
And I have one last question, and I ask it to every guest on Personable, is what is one thing that you would want a listener to take away from this episode?
Oh, I probably should have listened to more of your podcast, right? I'd be better prepared for that question. One thing to take away, I would say, is if you're in a position to lead, and that is multifaceted, it can be from a team of 2 people to leading a massive organization and everything in between. Just appreciate, even when it's tough, how privileged you are to be in that position of influence and that position of being able to mold other people's, who oftentimes don't really realize that you have their fate in their hands, and treat it as a privilege every day and be grateful for it.
What you said about culture being your culture is set by your worst value or attribute, get to an acceptable level of decline. Leadership is what happens when you leave the room. Creativity is disrupting the status quo. Your attitude towards risk and that the power of choice is incredibly important. I think those are things that, I mean, truly things that I've never heard before. And there's not often times that I'm kind of stunned. And I don't know if these are common things within the advertising industry, but those are truly things that I feel like I'm going to put the acceptable level of decline thing on my wall, because you hear things like that and it completely changes the way you view your life and what motivates you to go forward. On top of that, when I asked you the question with what makes your company different, I wasn't trying to take a stab at you, but I think it's always nice like to put people on their toes to see what they think a little bit.
Yeah.
And what I think is so unique, and I feel like it's also similar in the industry I'm trying to do, is so many companies have a product. They can say, oh, this is better than this because, it has this feature and it has this and it has this. But what I think is amazing about your industry is that the true USP is the people. It's the talent. It's the people like yourself that come up with ideas, that manage their teams in a way that enable to drive ideas, that think about things from a unique perspective. There's no way to challenge the status quo if you simply do the same that everyone else is doing. And I think it's incredible to hear your perspectives on things which truly do show that you are challenging the status quo. And your story at the end, with the loss of your mother, I'm incredibly sorry to hear about that. But it's very clear that you are having a great impact on people. I mean, the very fact that you are a leader within this organization, I'm sure you've already impacted thousands of people internally, but also externally through your campaigns, such as with BMW in Asia going to Cannes. So I feel, very appreciative for you coming on today. I feel like I've learned a lot, and I hope that this podcast can get out to a lot of people so that they can learn a lot themselves as well.
It's great, Harvey. Thank you for having me on. I'll leave you to one last point, what you said there. I think there's something else that one of the HBS lecturers, I can't remember which one, said to me, which is nothing guarantees mediocrity like success. And if you're sitting in there looking at your product and going, this product is X, Y, Z, you can fall back and be complacent, to your point. And I think, it's all about people, and it's all about staying on your toes, and it's all about that and challenging the status quo. And, I love what you're doing here, Harvey. I think it's great. Kudos to you. Thanks for having me on. I hope there was something in there that you or somebody gets out of it. If not, it was just wonderful to spend a little over an hour chatting to you.